Hi, everyone. My name is Claire, and I'm a student who attended Reason and Rationality along with Grace and Harry. And we also have Andrew, who goes to Kate School. So we're from all around the country, and we're here to discuss if we should pursue a life without pain and suffering. So if anyone wants to kickstart us off.
Yeah, sure. So I think the question we should be looking to answer here is like when we first look at it, it seems like pleasure and happiness are good things, and pain and suffering being the opposite of those things are bad things. And starting with those premises, which I think almost everyone would accept, the question we got to answer is, are there other different good things that come from pain and suffering? And the answer to that is going to, I think, be the answer to our larger question.
I think that's a good thought. My original the first place I went when I asked myself this question is what are we inherently as humans trying to do in life, right? And I think that naturally we're problem solvers, naturally we're people who want to achieve something, and happiness comes from achieving something or getting something that you didn't originally have. Or something that you're not used to. And I think that can only really happen if you have something more negative to compare it to. Um, I don't want to say, like, oh, there's no happiness without sadness, but I kind of almost am saying that because I feel like if you don't really work hard for something, you're not going to get as much happiness.
I agree. I think sadness and experiencing some degree of suffering, or I guess hardship as well, can help contextualize the happiness and almost give you greater capacity to feel rewarded by like things you set out to achieve if you go through all of the hard work and even the hardships to get there.
Yeah, I mean, at first that seems logical, but I think if we look at it from that perspective, and I'm inclined to agree, I think that something very close to there's no happiness without sadness might well be true. But that only really gives us like you need a small amount of sadness. Like at some point in your life, you need to experience sadness or feeling bad so that you can better appreciate your good feelings. But it seems like after that point, if this is our only point in favor of suffering, you should try to live a life with as little suffering as possible. So I'm wondering if maybe there's like another reason that pain and suffering might be beneficial. Like a classic example is character growth. Like I think it was Nietzsche's view that people actually needed to suffer more because it would make them better people. And I don't think that's strictly true, but something in the neighborhood of that might be true, and that might be an interesting thing to discuss.
So I have two thoughts. I want to address your point second. The first thing is that when I was saying, oh, there's no pain or there's no happiness without sadness, I thought of an example of food, right? And I know that's kind of shallow, but if you try something good, it's like a physical, like your taste buds, like something physical is happening, saying, oh, I like this food. And I don't think you need to try something bad in order for your body to like the taste of something else. Like, I think you could not have eaten anything in your life, like, have no idea what your taste buds do. Try something and know off the bat if you don't like it or like it. I don't think you have to have like a precedent of like goodness in order to decide how much you like it. And I don't know how much that applies to happiness because some people might argue that happiness is more of a like a dualist quality of like it's about the soul or about something not physical. Other people might say happiness is a physical sensation. In that case, maybe you don't actually need sadness because if happiness is something that happens in your body physically, then that could happen regardless of what you've experienced in the past. Um, and then just to touch on your point, I liked what you said about character growth. I think to add on to that, if we don't have suffering or pain, we might feel a little purposeless. Because I feel like when I get everything that I want, I almost feel like, oh, what am I doing? This is so easy. Like I feel bored. I feel like, oh, okay, great. Like life is great. That's it. So I think it's another thing of it gives you purpose and reason to keep going.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that everybody's bringing up. I think for me, it really helps me to think about the counterexample. You know, what does a life look like when we're trying to minimize pain and trying to maximize happiness? Does that mean that we're avoiding the hard things? And what does that mean? You know, is it we avoid everything that we think would be challenging to us? Is that just procrastination on a daily basis and 24/7? And I think if we take it to the extreme, then I mean, it just really doesn't make sense to pursue a life of minimal pain, or at least to make that your goal in life. So That's what I think.
So maybe we can reframe that a little to get to what I think is the interesting question here. Because, like, if we're going to do a strict utility calculation, of course, if we can have a little bit of suffering, but then we get like a massive amount of pleasure out of that, of course, that's good. And doing challenging things, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of that. You do challenging things because if you succeed in the challenging thing, you get something you really want. But I think the more interesting question is like, is there a distinct kind of good that can only come from experiencing suffering? Because, like, in the cases of those challenging moments, if we could somehow, like, remove the challenge from them and you could just get all the pleasure, all the satisfaction, but it wasn't difficult for you at all, most people would be like, hell yeah, I want to do that. So I think that's kind of what I was getting at with the character growth idea is that maybe there's certain things that you need the suffering, like that you can't have it all without the suffering.
And I think in response to Harry's question, I think there absolutely is. I think, in my opinion, there's a very distinct sense of happiness that comes from you having to work to achieving it rather than you just being happy. I mean, we could invent a drug that somebody can be on 24/7 and they'd be happy forever. But I think it's just, to me, it feels very different from something that comes from work or hardship.
I also wonder if, I guess, the experience of suffering, actually, in terms of like a utility perspective, can increase other people's utility. Because I do think that when one person suffers, they can offer kind of a greater perspective to the people that come after them. And I think there are ways in which just pure experiential, I guess, occurrences in our lives can really help us become better influences to the people after us. So I wonder if there could be a kind of like a utility maximizer there in some respect.
Grace, I think that's a really good point about the utility because it's like that is definitely a type of happiness that only comes out of someone suffering. I don't know how, I'm trying to think about how that would play into the personal life because if we're asking how should we individually pursue a life, do you think that maximizing other people's utility is improving our life? Maybe the feeling of, oh, I'm helping other people by suffering gives you like, pleasure because you know you're helping people. Or maybe they're just two separate things, and in that case, you suffering, even though it helps other people, doesn't actually make your life better.
I wonder if, yeah, I'm kind of inclined to think the former might ring true. At least I think there's definitely some sort of reward we can feel from knowing that our advice can help shape future generations, or even our achievements can help shape future generations, and not to place like the lives of future generations as inherently more important, or like that helping them should be a higher of higher importance than helping people in like our current lives. But I do think knowing that in some way we can be a good influence and we can guide future generations and just we can know that they have lives that wherein they'll be fulfilled can kind of reward us in our own suffering.
Here's a question though that I think you guys might find this interesting. Like, what if we had a person who doesn't care about any of that? Like, doesn't care about future generations, isn't interested in building their own character, just has no incentive to do all of the things that we've been talking about for the reasons we've been talking about them. Like, is suffering intrinsically valuable in such a way that even that person should still not try to avoid suffering to the maximum possible extent? What do you guys think about that?
I think so. Our one example was that a type of happiness you get from suffering is the helping of others, right? I think another type of happiness you get is accomplishment. So like when we say a good life or happiness, good kind of is a branch like it branches out into multiple different types of happiness you feel. And I think one of those happinesses is accomplishment, which I don't think you can get if you don't suffer. So if this person who doesn't care about helping other people just wants to do something for themselves and doesn't care about the things that you listed, they're the happiness they get is not going to be as much happiness they could get if they added that feeling of accomplishment onto it. So it's like if you have your number line, or not number line, but you have a little bar of good, you have like accomplishment, pleasure, whatever it is, their bar is going to be much smaller because they don't feel accomplishment. So I think in that sense, they would feel the incentive to suffer.
Yeah, I guess maybe another way to look at it is that like all the examples of suffering we've been looking at so far are suffering that you choose. So like for an example from my own life, I do like wrestling and jujitsu, and in sports like that, like often it physically hurts to compete. Like there's a lot of hardship, there's a lot of like physical pain at times. But all of that is my choice to engage in that. That's going to be a voluntary kind of hardship, right? Like you're
Okay.
choosing to deal with that. I'm wondering, like, is there a value to involuntary hardship as well? Or like, so when we ask, should we try to live a life without suffering? Can our answer to that be, well, you should like choose to suffer for the things that matter to you? Or is there like a broader answer that says, well, actually, sometimes suffering can be good even when you don't choose it? Sometimes something good can come out of that as well.
Yeah, I can respond to that. I think going back to what you said, Harry, before about character building, I think it's the same way, right? When you experience involuntary suffering, when I don't know, an unfortunate event befalls you, you go through a character building moment oftentimes if you're able to conquer that suffering. And in my opinion, that gives you long-term, benefits for your character and for learning from that allows you to deal with suffering later on in life and to experience more joy, I think, as a whole. And then to your point about value, I feel like it's very interesting. I mean, we've tended to define value in our conversation so far as like what's the greater good, but I feel like there's also an interesting element to it of the individual good as well, of what does it mean to live a good life individually, or to have a life that's free from restraint, or that's of your own choosing. And I think having involuntary suffering really contributes to that.
So I kind of want to push back on that because I think it's true that in certain cases, involuntary suffering really makes people into better people. And that might be seen as a net good when it happens. I mean, I'm not very much about the net good when I think about what we should pursue. But if you look at it in that way, that's the case. But then there's also many people who go through bad experiences and they don't really have meaningful character growth from it. Like that can actually have negative effects on a person's character in certain cases. And I don't know how you'd go about evaluating like what's the ratio of cases where it's good to cases where it's bad or so on. But it makes me wonder, like, is it the suffering, like should we consider the opportunity that the suffering gives you for character growth to be valuable in itself, or is the growth only valuable if it actually happens?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I truly believe, and I can't really explain this with words, but I really believe that the opportunity that involuntary suffering presents us is different, is distinctly different when we choose to engage or to subject ourselves to suffering. Um, and so in that way, I feel like it's intrinsically valuable.
So, follow-up question, because I want to push a little further on that. You've said, right, the opportunity to build your character to become a better person is a good thing in and of itself. It has intrinsic value, and that comes from suffering, obviously, a lot of the time. So, if this is a good thing, and it's good not only in a broad sense, but it's good for the person who gets the opportunity,
Right.
like couldn't we say, if we
I
go
see.
just based on that, that I'm looking out for another person's interests by making them suffer, at least in certain specific.
Yeah, yeah, I get what you're saying. That's a very good question. I think there's like a very distinct difference between something that's, and I don't know, this is probably like a comeback you expected, but there's something that's different between suffering that is given upon somebody by somebody else and with the negative intention, and then also that suffering that is, I would characterize it as being more natural. And that also kind of makes me think, what is natural? And but that is a very interesting question. But my answer is no. I don't think that we should actively give others suffering. I feel like that is also negative for the reasons of being immoral or things like that. But I feel like in the status quo, people who experience involuntary suffering and involuntary suffering itself is intrinsically valuable.
I think, and Grace, let me know what you think about this one. I think another factor is the extent to which they're suffering. So if I think teachers, right, all the time, they're like, here's this hard test. Obviously, taking a test is not suffering, but it's not very nice. It's not a really great experience, but they have the intention of making us grow. Or even when I did gymnastics, my teachers would push me down in the splits, right? They would like cause me physical pain to make me more flexible. And people can argue if that's actually moral or not, but they had the intention to make me more flexible and to have me grow from that. And so, because the amount of suffering wasn't too bad, I think it was good that they kind of pushed me, knowing that I was going to grow from that.
I completely agree with the like idea of degrees of suffering because I think it's just impossible to live a life as a human where we or our actions, even if it's unintentional, don't cause at least a small degree of harm to other people. And I don't know, I mean, even simply something as like responding to an email, like if someone doesn't hear a response, that might throw off. Like there's so many little things we do that we don't know the impact we have on other people's lives. And I don't think we can really say that every single act of that, which causes the person at least even a tiny degree of suffering, is always immoral because sometimes that's never the intention behind it. And sometimes involuntary suffering, or I guess maybe we just have to accept some degree of involuntary suffering to be a human that can interact thoughtfully with others.
So, two things. One, I feel like with the examples of the gymnastics case and the school case, there's still an element of choice involved in both of those. Like maybe if you're a minor, you don't have legal autonomy, it's the parents making the choice on your behalf, but I struggle to characterize that as involuntary in the sense that I think Andrew and I were maybe talking about earlier. Uh, the second thing is the point about intent, right? I think it's of course if you don't intend to cause someone to suffer, but you still make them suffer in a very minor way, that's probably not blameworthy or it's blameworthy only to a very small extent. But still, if we're going to look at the question of like, well, if giving someone the opportunity for growth is in their interests, and that opportunity from growth doesn't just come from really minor suffering, it comes from like more significant suffering, we might still, on that analysis, have a reason to cause other people to suffer in a more significant way and to do so intentionally. Because if the good of the opportunity outweighs the actual pain or hardship or whatever, then it seems like you have a case where your action has a good consequence that outweighs the bad consequence. And if your theory of what you should do is just I should do what's going to have the best consequences, then you have good reason to do that thing.
I think a good response to that would be everybody does suffer from involuntary suffering by by so many ways, right? Natural disasters, injury, accident, whatever it is, that it's like they're gonna go through it. It's not our job to do that. It's not our place because they're going to, it's inevitable. Something's gonna happen to everyone at some point. Why do we need to step in and say, oh, I'm gonna be the one to cause it? Because maybe this sounds a little bit too much like fate, but it's like the suffering that people are gonna go through, or this sounds a little wrong because I don't want to say that someone's, getting cancer or someone like house burning down is like a good thing, but in certain cases, I think it's almost like what was going to happen is going to happen, and we shouldn't be the ones to step in and say it's our job to cause you suffering so you can grow because something else will do that for them.
I think I want to recharacterize that. Maybe what we should say is like the reason you shouldn't do that is because you can't predict the consequences of it. You don't know if a person's actually going to take advantage of that opportunity. But if we put it that way, then it needs to be the growth itself that's the good consequence and not the opportunity to have growth.
I was going to say exactly that because you keep saying the good outweighs the bad. I think the point there is that we don't know. A lot of times bad things happen, a lot of suffering happens, and it sticks with people. It ruins their life and it was just always bad. Like no good thing or no better thing came from that. And that happens a lot. So with that risk in mind, we should never cause someone suffering because we can't promise that the good will outweigh the bad. And that's why people shouldn't take the risk, especially because that person will have consequences too.
Yeah, that just like the only it's just that if we want to stick to our idea of holding that the opportunity in itself is a good that makes the suffering worthwhile, then that reasoning doesn't hold up. So I'm thinking that to do this on a consequence-based analysis, to have a good explanation for why you shouldn't make other people suffer, you would need to say that it's not the opportunity that has the value, it's the actual growth.
I don't know if this point fits in exactly well, and I don't know exactly how to articulate this, but I almost feel like forcing suffering onto people, in some respects, to me, almost comes off as like an infringement on their autonomy. And I don't know how to like expand on that because I mean, the suffering is kind of outside of people. Obviously, they're going through emotional experience, but the suffering is kind of outside of them, right? It's a some factor in their life. But for some reason, to me, if we choose to kind of put more suffering onto people or exacerbate that, it feels almost like we're taking away some of their natural rights. I don't know, that there's something, it's not natural. There's something like we're taking away some degree of human autonomy. And I don't know, maybe that has a place in kind of combating the argument.
Yeah, I think I want to look at it more as like when I'm the person, let's say that there's another individual and they're the target individual of whatever suffering I'm about to inflict upon them. It's hypothetical. And and I think I would evaluate my actions in two separate sections, right? The section of my actions that I am actively doing upon this individual. And because I inflict suffering, I think it's very reasonable to assume that whatever action I just did to this person was immoral in the first place. So in that way, I feel like it's never right to intentionally inflict suffering on somebody else because your actions themselves are probably going to be very immoral. And then as to like, and then the second part of it is they experience the suffering and whether they grow from it. And that's what we've been talking about. And I think they're both really, really great ways of looking at it. Whether it's you look at it as an opportunity or you look at it as the value as being part of the growth. I think there's both ways to look at it from those two sides. But whatever you decide to look at it from, whatever the perspective, I think it all leads to the same conclusion.
I think that was a really nice like call to action. And I think it's a little funny because we started with the question, should we pursue a life without suffering? We agreed within the first minute we should, and then we ended up answering, should we, because it's good and because we should do that, is it our right to help almost like catapult that process for other people? And I really like the what you said about how it's immoral. I mean, I think in an ideal world, like yes, if you are helping someone, it makes sense to do whatever necessary, like do whatever's necessary, even if that means you're gonna be the villain. But I feel like we all had really good arguments for why that would be wrong. So that said, I guess I really like that we value character development, and clearly we're not hedonists in any way, which is nice to hear. But yeah, so thank you so much for joining me. Does anyone have any last thoughts and before we wrap up?
Just thanks for hosting this. Good place to stop because I was about to bring up Kant and then we'd have been going for a while.
Yeah, well, perfect. So we will see all of you next episode, which will be coming out soon within the month or so. So thank you.